I was sitting at my son's dinner table when he leaned toward his wife and said something that made them both laugh. It wasn't English. It wasn't meant for me. I smiled, kept eating, and let him believe I didn't understand. What he didn't know was that I'd learned that language 40 years earlier, and every word he said was a mistake. I had driven 3 hours to get there straight after work, because my son Daniel insisted this dinner mattered. He said it was just family, said his wife wanted to cook something special, said it would mean a lot to him if I showed up. Daniel was 42 now, successful, confident, the kind of man who spoke fast and expected the world to keep up. I was 71, retired, careful with my words, careful with my silences. When I walked into his dining room that night, I already felt like a guest in a place that used to belong to me. The table was set perfectly, almost too perfectly, like a photograph from a magazine. His wife Claire smiled the way people do when they're being polite, instead of warm. Daniel poured wine without asking if I wanted it. "Long drive, Dad," he said, not looking at me. I nodded and sat where he pointed, the chair furthest from him. That should have been my first warning, but parents are trained to ignore small slights. We call them misunderstandings. We call them nothing. Dinner started calmly enough. Daniel talked about work, about a promotion he was chasing, about a client who didn't know his place. Claire laughed when he laughed, nodded when he nodded. I listened, asked the safe questions, chewed slowly. Halfway through the meal, Daniel leaned toward her and spoke in a language he thought was private. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away, and they both smiled. I felt something tighten in my chest, not because I was confused, but because I understood him perfectly. He called me old. He called me useless. He joked that I wouldn't understand the contract anyway, that I should just sign and smile. Claire covered her mouth, pretending not to laugh. I kept my face still, kept eating, let the silence stretch. Daniel looked at me, waiting for a reaction that never came, that seemed to please him even more. "Everything okay, Dad?" he asked, switching back to English. His tone was sweet, almost caring. I nodded again. "Food's good," I said. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. Inside, though, memories were lining up, waiting their turn. 40 years earlier, I'd learned that language in a factory overseas, when Daniel was still in diapers and I was sending money home instead of letters. I'd learned it the hard way, word by word, insult by insult. After dinner, Daniel slid a folder across the table. "Just something we need you to look at," he said. "It's about the house, my house. The one I'd paid off 20 years ago. The one he grew up in." I didn't open the folder right away. I looked at him instead. His jaw was set, his smile practiced. Claire stood and began clearing plates, suddenly very busy. "It's nothing complicated," Daniel said quickly. "Just a formality." Then he leaned toward Claire again and spoke softly in that same language. He said I wouldn't dare say no. He said I needed him more than he needed me. That one hurt more than the rest. I still didn't react. I simply opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, highlighted in yellow, places marked with sticky notes. "Transfer of ownership, temporary," it said. "For convenience," it said. My name would stay on the paperwork, but control would move to him. "In case something happens," Daniel said. "It's better this way." He didn't explain what something meant. He didn't have to. I asked one question. "Who wrote this up?" Daniel hesitated. Just for a second. "My lawyer," he said. That was the first lie of the night I could prove. The formatting was wrong. The language was rushed. This wasn't a lawyer's work. This was someone hoping I wouldn't look closely. Claire returned and stood behind Daniel, resting her hands on his shoulders. He leaned back into her, comfortable, confident. Then he spoke again in that language, slower this time. He said if I didn't sign, they'd make my life difficult. He said they'd already talked about options. Claire squeezed his shoulders in agreement. That was when I finally looked up. I'll need time, I said. Daniel sighed, loud enough to sound disappointed. Dad, it's just paperwork. He switched languages again and said I was being stubborn, that I always had been. I folded the documents carefully and slid them back across the table. I'll take them home, I said. Read them properly. The silence that followed was sharp. Daniel's smile faded. Claire stepped back. For the first time that night, I saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. Daniel stood, collected the folder, and shook his head. No, he said. You can read them here. He spoke in English now, but his eyes said something else. Control, pressure, hurry. I stood slowly, my knees, protesting. I'm tired, I said. Long drive. I thanked Claire for the meal. I shook Daniel's hand instead of hugging him. That surprised him. He watched me walk to the door, his mouth tight, his thoughts loud even without words. As I drove away, my phone buzzed, a text from Daniel. Don't make this hard. That was all it said. I didn't reply. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was already moving ahead, replaying every word he'd thought I didn't understand. He believed this was a simple transaction. He believed I was alone. He was wrong about both. And as the road darkened ahead of me, one question kept repeating in my head. How far was my son willing to go to take what he thought was already his? I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, but because I was alert in a way I hadn't been for years. When you reach your 70s, you get used to being underestimated. People assume you're slow, sentimental, easy to push. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed Daniel's words in that language. Every insult, every assumption. What stayed with me most wasn't the cruelty. It was the confidence. He truly believed I had no leverage. The next morning, I made coffee and spread the documents from memory across my kitchen table, recreating them line by line in my head. I'd asked him to let me take them, and he'd refused. That meant urgency. Urgency meant pressure. Pressure usually meant someone else was involved. I picked up my phone and called Mark, an old friend from work, a man who'd spent 30 years untangling corporate messes and family disasters. When I told him what happened, he didn't interrupt. When I finished, he only asked one question. Did he threaten you in writing? I thought of the text. Don't make this hard. Yes, I said. By noon, Mark had already found the law firm Daniel claimed to be using. They'd never heard of him. That confirmed what I suspected. This wasn't a careful plan. It was a rushed one. That afternoon, another message came in from Daniel. Claire's upset. She feels disrespected. I smiled at that. It was always easier to make yourself the victim when you were already holding the knife. I replied with one sentence. We'll talk soon. Nothing more. 2 days later, Daniel called me. His voice was calm, controlled, rehearsed. He said he was worried about my memory. Said he just wanted to protect me. He said it in English, but I could hear the translation underneath, the same tone he used with Claire. When I didn't agree right away, he sighed and switched languages again, thinking it would push me. He said I was becoming a problem. I let him finish. Then I said, in that same language, be careful how you speak to me. The silence on the other end was immediate and deep. He laughed, forced and sharp. You understood that? He asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He hung up shortly after. And within minutes, Claire texted me for the first time in years. Daniel stressed. This is for your own good. I didn't respond to her either. Instead, I called the county records office and requested copies of every document tied to my house. It took hours, but when I was done, I saw the shape of what they were trying to do. There was a lien attempt, recent and sloppy, filed under a shell company with an address that led to a closed storefront. It hadn't gone through yet. Someone had stopped it, that someone was an overworked clerk who noticed a mismatch in dates. Luck for now, was on my side. But luck runs out if you sit still. That evening, Mark came over. We sat at the same table where my wife and I used to argue about bills and vacations. I told him everything, including the language, the insults, the threats. He didn't look surprised. "They think you won't fight," he said. "That's their mistake." A week passed without contact. Then Daniel invited me to dinner again. Same house, same tone. "We should clear the air," he said. I agreed, not because I wanted peace, but because I wanted to see how far he'd already gone. When I arrived, the atmosphere was different. Claire was overly friendly. Daniel hugged me this time. Held on a second too long. Halfway through the meal, he brought out new papers. Different formatting. Cleaner. Real lawyer this time. He explained slowly, as if talking to a child. Trust. Protection. Family. He didn't switch languages this time. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Sign or else. When I asked what else meant, Claire answered for him. "We worry about accidents," she said softly. "Falls, confusion." Daniel nodded. There it was. The real threat, not legal. Personal. I pushed the papers away. "I won't sign tonight," I said. Daniel's face tightened. He glanced at Claire, then spoke in that language again, anger bleeding through the words. He said I was forcing his hand. He said there were other ways. Claire said nothing, but her eyes stayed on me. Calculating. I stood up. Heart steady. Voice calm. "This conversation is over," I said. For now, as I reached the door, Daniel spoke in English, loud enough to follow me out. "Don't test me." I turned back and looked at him. Really looked at him, and for the first time I saw fear behind the anger. Not fear of losing money. Fear of being exposed. That night, as I drove home, my phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't Daniel. It was an unfamiliar number. And when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Mr. Harris, we need to talk about what your son has been doing." The woman on the phone introduced herself as Linda Perez, and she didn't waste time easing into it. She said she worked in adult protective services, said my name had come up during a routine inquiry, and said she needed to ask me a few questions. Her tone was professional, but there was caution underneath it, like she was choosing each word carefully. I told her I was listening. She asked if my son had recently expressed concerns about my mental fitness. I laughed once, quietly, then stopped when I realized she wasn't joking. Linda explained that an anonymous report had been filed suggesting I was showing signs of confusion, poor judgment, and vulnerability to financial exploitation. She didn't say my son's name, but she didn't need to. I asked when the report was filed. 3 days ago, she said. That lined up perfectly with Daniel's sudden silence and Claire's carefully worded message. I thanked her for calling and told her I'd cooperate fully. Before we hung up, she added something that made my grip tighten. "You should know," she said. This report included supporting statements. The next morning, Linda arrived at my house. She looked around carefully, asked polite questions, took notes. I answered calmly, showed her my bills, my records, my medication list. She nodded often, more relaxed as the visit went on. When she left, she said she saw no immediate concerns, but investigations took time. "Be cautious," she said. "Sometimes families escalate when they feel they're losing control." That word stuck with me, control. It explained everything. 2 days later, Daniel showed up unannounced. He stood on my porch, smiling too wide, holding coffee like a peace offering. "Just checking on you," he said. I let him in. He looked around, eyes scanning, measuring. He talked about work, about stress, about how hard it was to worry about an aging parent. I let him talk. Then he switched languages again. Casually, cruelly, he said, "The report should scare me." He said it was for my own good. I replied in the same language. Calmly, that threats were easier to prove than lies. His smile froze. That was when he changed tactics. He apologized. Said he was overwhelmed. Said Claire was pushing him. Said he never meant to hurt me. It was a good performance. Polished and emotional. The kind that worked on people who wanted to believe. I told him I needed space. He nodded, hugged me again, and whispered in English, "We're not done." After he left, I called Mark and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They're trying to build a case. You need to build one faster." Over the next week, small things began to happen. My bank flagged an unusual inquiry. A neighbor mentioned Daniel had asked about my routines. Claire sent messages asking if I was feeling confused lately. Each thing alone meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern. Pressure from every angle, all designed to make me doubt myself or look unstable to others. That was the moment I stopped reacting and started planning. I met with a lawyer Mark trusted, a woman named Susan who listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question. "Do you want to protect yourself or do you want to stop them?" I told her I wanted both. She nodded and laid out options. Documentation, witnesses, preemptive evaluations, transparency. People who manipulate rely on secrecy, she said. We remove that. They lose leverage. I agreed to everything. The first evaluation came back clean. The second did too. Susan filed them proactively. We requested records tied to the report. That's when we found something interesting. The supporting statements weren't from doctors or professionals. They were from family. Daniel, Claire, even a distant cousin I barely spoke to, all claiming concern, all repeating the same phrases. It read like a script. Susan smiled when she saw it. "This helps us," she said. "Coordination is harder to hide than concern." That evening, Daniel called again. Furious now, he demanded to know why strangers were calling him. I told him calmly that honesty had a way of spreading. He yelled, switched languages, accused me of betrayal. I listened until he ran out of words. Then I said, "You started this." He hung up without replying. 2 nights later, I received a message from Claire, sent by mistake or desperation. It wasn't meant for me. It was in that language, panicked, telling Daniel they'd gone too far, that lawyers were involved, that someone from the county had asked questions at her work. She deleted it seconds later. I took a screenshot. That was the moment I knew the balance had shifted. Linda called again the next day. She said the report was being reviewed, said inconsistencies had been noted. She asked if anyone had pressured me recently. I told her the truth. Not angrily, not dramatically, just facts, dates, words, languages. Silence followed. "Thank you," she said finally. That clarifies a lot. When the call ended, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief, edged with resolve. That weekend, Daniel invited me to meet him alone. "Neutral place," he said, "just to talk." I agreed. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. He looked tired now, not confident. He spoke carefully, avoiding jokes, avoiding languages. He asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted respect. I wanted the truth. He stared at his coffee and said nothing. Outside, a storm was rolling in, slow and heavy, and as I watched the clouds gather, one thought stayed with me. If he was already this desperate, what would he do when he realized how much I'd uncovered, and how little time he had left to stop it? Daniel didn't finish his coffee. He pushed the cup away like it offended him, leaned back, and studied my face as if trying to decide which version of me he was dealing with. "You've changed," he said finally. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence do what it was supposed to do. He shifted, uncomfortable, then added, "I just want this to be over." That was the first honest thing he'd said in weeks, but it wasn't a request for peace. It was a plea for control. "I want it over too," I said. "That depends on what you do next." He laughed once, sharp and humorless, and asked what I meant by that. I told him the report to adult services was being reviewed, that lawyers were involved, that mistakes had been noticed. I didn't threaten him. I didn't accuse him. I just stated facts. His jaw tightened. He glanced toward the window, then back at me. "Claire's worried," he said. "She thinks you're turning this into something it doesn't have to be." I looked at him steadily. "She already did that." He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and spoke in English, carefully. "You don't understand how bad this could get." I answered him in the other language, just one sentence, quiet and precise. His eyes widened before he could stop them. I said I understood exactly how bad it could get, and that he should be very careful what he tried next. The color drained from his face. For a moment the mask slipped, and I saw panic. Then it was gone. He stood up, tossed a few bills on the table, and left without another word. That afternoon, Susan called me. "They're scrambling," she said. "That usually means mistakes." She told me Daniel had contacted a different lawyer, one known for aggressive tactics. "Expect something soon," she warned. She was right. 2 days later, I was served papers at my door. Daniel was petitioning for temporary guardianship, citing concern for my safety and finances. The filing was rushed, full of exaggerations and half-truths, but it was real. The stakes had just jumped. Susan moved quickly. She filed a response, attached evaluations, bank statements, correspondence. She requested an emergency hearing. "They wanted to scare you," she said. "Now they have to explain themselves." The night before the hearing, I received a voicemail from Claire. She sounded tired, brittle. "Please," she said, "just sign the papers. We can make this go away." She didn't mention love. She didn't mention family. Only convenience. I deleted the message and went to bed early. The hearing was brief but tense. Daniel sat across from me, eyes down, jaw clenched. Claire wasn't there. His lawyer spoke confidently at first, then slowed as Susan presented evidence. Dates didn't line up. Claims contradicted records. The judge asked questions. Daniel couldn't answer without looking at his attorney. When it was over, the petition was denied. Not dismissed forever, but denied for now. The judge warned against further misuse of the system. Daniel didn't look at me as we left. He walked out fast, like someone trying to outrun a thought. For a few days things were quiet. Too quiet. Then Mark called with news. The shell company tied to the lien attempt had been dissolved abruptly. Accounts were closed. Paper trails were being erased. "That's not confidence," he said. "That's cleanup." I agreed. That evening my bank flagged another inquiry, this time tied to an old account I hadn't touched in years. Someone was fishing, hoping to find something overlooked. I tightened security, froze access, documented everything. Claire reached out again, this time pretending none of it had happened. She sent photos of a recent vacation, talked about a new car. The message underneath was clear. She wanted to reset the narrative, to act like I was the unreasonable one. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded everything to Susan. "Good," she said. "Inconsistency helps us." Then she added something that made my stomach drop. "There's a chance they'll escalate personally if legal routes fail." She didn't have to explain what that meant. The next week, my neighbor called to say Daniel had stopped by while I was out, asked if I seemed confused lately, asked if I was sleeping okay. He'd smiled the whole time. I thanked her and wrote everything down. That night, as I locked my doors, I felt something close to fear for the first time. Not because I felt powerless, but because I saw how willing my son was to keep pushing. A few days later, Linda called again. She said the original report was officially closed, but new information had come in. "Someone contacted us, claiming you were being manipulated by an outside advisor," she said. I asked, "Who?" She couldn't say, but we both knew. I told her about the hearing, the lawyers, the texts. She sighed. "This is becoming a pattern," she said. "Patterns matter. Daniel called me late that night. His voice was flat, controlled. He said we needed to talk, that this had gone too far. I agreed to meet him again, but this time on my terms. Public place. Witnesses nearby. When we met, he didn't sit down right away. He paced, hands shaking slightly. "What do you want?" he asked, again. I told him I wanted him to stop, to back away, to let things cool down. He laughed, bitter. "You think you can just walk away now?" he said. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo. My house, taken from across the street, time stamped minutes earlier. Underneath it, one line of text. "We need to talk tonight." I looked up at Daniel. He was staring at my phone. His face told me everything I needed to know, and as I stood there, surrounded by strangers, one question burned through my mind. If he was willing to watch me this closely, what line had he not yet crossed, and how far would he go when he realized I wasn't backing down? The photo stayed on my screen long after Daniel looked away, pretending he hadn't seen it, pretending it meant nothing. I slipped the phone into my pocket and told him calmly that we were done for the night. He scoffed, said I was being dramatic, said the picture proved nothing, but his voice cracked at the end. Just enough to give him away. I left without another word, walking slower than I felt, aware of every car, every shadow, every step behind me, forcing myself not to turn around. When I got home, I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the driveway, listening, letting the quiet settle. Nothing moved. Still, I unlocked the door and locked it again behind me, then checked every window like someone half my age. I called Susan and told her about the message. She didn't hesitate. She said I needed to document it immediately and not confront Daniel alone again. "This crossed a line," she said. "Surveillance changes everything." Her voice wasn't calm anymore. It was sharp, focused, protective. The next morning Linda called before I finished breakfast. She said they'd received another report, this one claiming I was paranoid and imagining threats. I almost laughed. Instead, I told her about the photo, the timing, the escalation. She went quiet. Then she asked me to email it to her. "This matters," she said. "Patterns matter, but evidence matters more." After we hung up, I forwarded everything to Susan as well. She replied with one sentence. "Do not delete anything." By afternoon, Daniel sent a message pretending nothing had happened. He asked if I wanted to have lunch. Said we needed to reset. I didn't reply. Claire texted later, angrier, accusing me of tearing the family apart. She wrote that Daniel was losing sleep, that his health was suffering. I stared at the words, recognizing the tactic. Guilt, pressure, responsibility. I forwarded her message too. That evening Mark stopped by, his face serious. "I checked something," he said. "Your house photo wasn't taken from the street. It was from a parked car. That detail changed how the room felt. Someone hadn't just passed by. Someone had waited." I asked. How he knew. He explained angles, reflections, small things I would have missed. Then he said something worse. The timestamp matches when Daniel said he was still at work. I didn't speak for a moment. Mark didn't push. Finally, I asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Do you think he's trying to scare me? Or build a case?" Mark exhaled slowly. "Both," he said. "Fear makes people slip." The following day, Susan filed for a protective order, not against Daniel directly, but against harassment and intimidation. It was strategic. It forced the issue into the open without escalating emotionally. Daniel was notified that afternoon. Within hours, my phone rang. He was shouting before I could say hello, accusing me of betrayal, of turning strangers against him. Halfway through, he switched languages. Furious, careless, he said. I was ruining his life. I replied calmly, in the same language, that he had done that himself. Silence followed. Then his voice dropped. "You think you're winning?" he said. You have no idea what Claire gave up for this. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. Gave up what? I told Susan about it immediately. She asked if Claire had family money. I said yes. Some, missy. She nodded. Then this isn't just about you, she said. It's about expectations. That night, I barely slept, my mind replaying conversations, searching for what I'd missed. 2 days later, Claire showed up at my door alone. No warning, no smile. She looked smaller somehow, less polished. I didn't invite her in. She didn't ask. She said Daniel was spiraling, that things had gone too far, that they never meant for it to become hostile. I listened without interrupting. Then she said something. She clearly hadn't planned to. We just needed the house temporarily. Temporarily for what? I asked. She hesitated. To secure financing, she said quietly. That was the crack. I asked, financing for what? She looked past me, then back. A business deal, she said. One that's already in motion. She realized too late what she'd revealed. I thanked her for coming and told her to leave. She didn't argue. When she drove away, I called Susan again. Her reaction was immediate. That's motive, she said. And motive turns pressure into intent. She told me to expect one more push. Desperate people. She said, always try once more. That push came sooner than expected. The next morning, I received notice of a new filing, this time challenging my competency with additional affidavits attached. Different names. Same language, same phrasing. Someone was rushing, copying, hoping quantity would overwhelm truth. Susan was ready. She filed a response within hours, stronger than before, including Claire's statement as context. They're overreaching, she said. Judges noticed that. Still, as I sat alone that evening, one thought kept circling. If they were willing to risk everything legally, what would stop them from risking something worse? The court date was set quickly, sooner than anyone expected, and that alone told me how aggressive Daniel had become. Susan explained that judges didn't appreciate being dragged into family disputes unless something serious was alleged, and Daniel's filings were beginning to look less like concern and more like obsession. Still, urgency cuts both ways. The faster this moved, the less room there was for mistakes, and I could feel the weight of that every time I picked up my phone. 2 nights before the hearing, Daniel showed up again. This time he didn't knock. He stood at the edge of my driveway, hands in his pockets, waiting until I noticed him through the window. I didn't open the door. I spoke through it instead. He said he just wanted to talk, that lawyers had twisted everything, that this was getting out of control. I told him to leave. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He simply said, very quietly, "You're forcing me to protect myself." That sentence landed heavier than any shout. I called Susan immediately. She told me not to engage further, that his presence alone after notice of the protective filing mattered. He's documenting you, she said. Whether he knows it or not. The next morning, Linda called again. Her tone was different now, firmer. She said the repeated reports and contradictory statements were being flagged internally. This is no longer about your safety, she said. It's about misuse of the system. Hearing that didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. The story was finally aligning with the truth, but alignment often comes right before collapse. At the hearing, Daniel looked nothing like the confident man from the first dinner. He looked tired, tense, restless. His lawyer argued forcefully, painting a picture of a worried son trapped by a stubborn father. Susan countered calmly, presenting timelines, screenshots, transcripts, evaluations. When she played the recording of Daniel switching languages mid-threat, the room went still. The judge asked Daniel if he'd like to explain. He tried. He failed. The words tangled. The story shifted. The confidence drained. The ruling was decisive. The petition was dismissed with prejudice. The judge warned Daniel against further filings without new evidence and advised all parties to cease contact unless through counsel. It wasn't justice served fully, but it was protection. As we left the courthouse, Daniel didn't look at me. Claire wasn't there. Outside, Susan put a hand on my arm. "This is the turning point," she said. "What happens next depends on whether they accept it." They didn't. That night, my bank called about a flagged transaction attempt tied to an old joint account. Daniel had once been listed on decades earlier. It had been dormant, forgotten. Until now, someone had tried to reactivate it. I froze everything immediately. Mark confirmed the attempt came from an IP linked to Claire's office. When I told Susan, she didn't sound surprised. "They're running out of doors," she said. "So they're trying old ones." The next morning, Claire emailed me directly, long and emotional, claiming Daniel was breaking down, claiming she feared for his health. She apologized for misunderstandings, asked for forgiveness, asked for cooperation. Halfway through, she slipped. She mentioned the deal again, the one that needed collateral. She said they were already committed, already exposed. I forwarded the email without responding. Susan called me an hour later. "That's it," she said. "That's the admission." She advised me to stay quiet and let the process work. Then came the reset moment, the one that changed how I saw everything. Linda called again, but this time she wasn't alone. She said another agency had joined the review. She said concerns had shifted away from me entirely. "You should know," she added. "Someone has been contacting multiple departments under different names." She paused. "We believe it's coordinated." Hearing that felt like the floor dropping out from under a story I thought I understood. This wasn't just desperation. It was strategy, badly executed. Daniel called that evening once, then twice. I didn't answer. The third time he left a voicemail. His voice was shaking now. He said he needed my help, that everything was falling apart, that Claire was furious, that investors were asking questions. He said one word that stuck with me: fraud. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. Susan heard the message and told me to save it. "That's awareness," she said. "And awareness has consequences." The following day, news came through Mark that I hadn't expected. One of the investors tied to Daniel's deal had pulled out abruptly after being contacted by regulators. Another followed hours later. The structure was collapsing. Daniel showed up at my house again, this time frantic, pounding on the door. I didn't open it. He shouted apologies, then accusations, then silence. Eventually he left. That night I slept for the first time in weeks. Not because things were over, but because I knew where they were headed. 2 days later, Susan called with urgency in her voice. "There's going to be a development," she said. "Possibly public." She wouldn't say more over the phone. All she said was to prepare myself and not respond emotionally to anything I heard. As I hung up, my phone buzzed with a notification from a local news site. It mentioned an investigation into financial misrepresentation tied to a small business venture. The names weren't listed yet, but the timing was unmistakable. I sat at my kitchen table, the same place where this all began, and thought about the dinner, the language, the laughter meant to exclude me. Daniel had believed silence meant ignorance. He'd mistaken patience for weakness. Now the world was beginning to look where I'd been forced to look for months. As the notification screen dimmed, one question remained unresolved, heavy and unavoidable. When everything finally came out, would my son try to pull me down with him, or would he finally understand the cost of pushing too far? The news alert didn't name Daniel, but it didn't need to. By morning my phone was ringing with numbers I hadn't heard from in years. Old coworkers, a cousin, someone from the neighborhood. They all asked the same careful question, circling the truth without touching it. I told them I didn't know much yet. That was true. What I knew felt heavier than facts. It felt like consequence finally moving faster than excuses. Susan called early and told me to stay home. If reporters come, don't answer, she said. If Daniel calls, don't engage. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was urgency. She said filings had been updated overnight, expanded to include misrepresentation and coercion. Not criminal charges yet, but the kind of language that opened doors you couldn't easily close. I thanked her and hung up, then sat quietly, listening to the house settle around me. By noon, Daniel's name appeared online, not in a headline, but buried in an article about a failed venture and questioned guarantees. I read it twice. Slowly, his role was described vaguely, but enough to connect dots. The house, the pressure, the rush. Claire's family money mentioned only as private backing. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not satisfaction, not relief, but grief. This wasn't the justice story's promise. This was something messier. Daniel called again that afternoon. I let it ring. Claire texted instead. Frantic now, no longer careful. She said they were being investigated, that everything was misunderstood, that Daniel was sick with worry. She said my silence was cruel. I didn't reply, told it to Susan, and turned my phone face down. Outside, a car slowed in front of my house, then moved on. I didn't look out the window. That evening, Linda came by in person. She said the review was complete, that the reports against me were officially marked unfounded and malicious. She said the coordination had been documented. She didn't say Daniel's name, but her eyes did. You did the right thing, she said. I nodded. Right didn't feel like a victory. It felt like survival. Before she left, she said something quietly. Sometimes the danger isn't what people do to you, she said. It's what they do when they realize they can't. That night, Daniel showed up one last time. Not angry, not shouting. He stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, hands empty. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. He looked older than his years, smaller than I remembered. I messed up, he said. No language tricks, no threats, just that. I waited. He swallowed and said the deal was collapsing, that people were asking questions, that Claire was furious, that he didn't know how to fix it. I asked him one question. Why did you think I wouldn't understand? He looked at me, confused. I repeated it, slower. He said he didn't know what I meant. I answered him in the other language, repeating his words from that first dinner, exactly as he'd said them. His face went pale. I heard everything, I said. From the start. He stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. He tried to explain. Fear, pressure, expectations. He said everyone assumed I'd just go along. He said he didn't think it would get this far. I listened, because listening was the last thing I could still give him. When he finished, I told him the truth, that I loved him, that I didn't trust him, that those two things could exist at the same time. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and for a moment he looked like the boy who used to wait up for me by the window. He asked if I could help him now. I said no, not because I wanted revenge, but because help had turned into leverage too many times. I told him he needed his own lawyer, his own consequences, his own path forward. He nodded again, defeated, and stepped back. Before he left, he said something that stayed with me. I didn't think you were paying attention, he said. I watched him walk down the steps and disappear into the dark. The next days moved quickly. More articles, more withdrawals. Claire's name appeared briefly, then vanished. Friends stopped calling. Silence returned, heavier but cleaner. Susan confirmed there would be no further action against me, and that Daniel's situation was now out of my hands legally. Mark came by with coffee and said, "It's over for you." I corrected him. "It's changed," I said. Over implied peace. This was something else. Weeks passed. The house felt different, quieter in a way that wasn't empty. I started sleeping through the night again. I cooked meals for one and ate them slowly. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Daniel's lawyer, formal and brief, acknowledging boundaries and requesting no contact for now. I signed the acknowledgement and mailed it back. That was my final signature in this story. Sometimes I replay that dinner in my head. The laughter, the assumption, the words meant to be hidden. I think about how close I came to doubting myself, to shrinking to fit someone else's plan. I think about how silence can be mistaken for ignorance, and patience for weakness. They're not the same. They never were. What happens next isn't dramatic. There's no applause, no final confrontation, just consequences unfolding at their own pace. My son chose his path. I chose mine. And as I sit at my table now, looking at the quiet street outside, one thought stays with me. Understanding isn't always power. Sometimes it's protection. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful at first. It was watchful. I caught myself listening for sounds that weren't there, checking my phone even when it hadn't buzzed, replaying conversations that were already finished. When something ends badly, it doesn't end cleanly. It leaves behind habits, reflexes, questions that don't disappear just because the noise stops. I told myself that was normal. Susan said it would fade. I wasn't sure I believed her. About a month after Daniel's last visit, I received a letter that didn't come from a lawyer. It was handwritten, careful, almost shaky. Claire. She said she was staying with her sister. She said Daniel was barely speaking to her. She said everything had spiraled faster than she expected. She didn't apologize directly. Instead, she wrote about fear, about pressure, about promises she shouldn't have trusted. The letter ended with one line that unsettled me more than the rest. There are things you still don't know. I didn't respond. I showed the letter to Susan instead. She read it twice, then folded it slowly. This could be phishing, she said. Or it could be fear, I asked. Which was worse? She didn't answer. She told me to stay alert, to keep documenting, to assume nothing was finished until it truly was. That night, I dreamed of the dinner again, but this time the table was empty, and the voices came from another room, muffled, urgent. 2 weeks later, Mark called with news he didn't like. Daniel's venture hadn't just collapsed. It was being examined retroactively. Past transactions, early investors, family money. They're widening the lens, he said. And when that happens, people start talking. He didn't need to say more when pressure builds. Secrets look for exits, and secrets don't care who they hurt on the way out. The first hint came in the form of a voicemail from a man I didn't recognize. He introduced himself quickly, said he'd worked with Daniel briefly, said he thought I should know something. His voice was nervous, rushed. He claimed Daniel had mentioned using my house as leverage, long before I knew anything about it. Not legally, he said. As an assumption. He talked like it was already handled, the man said. Like you were on board. I saved the message and sent it to Susan without replying. Susan called back immediately. That's important, she said. It shows intent, not just reaction. She told me not to contact the man again unless advised. She also told me something else, something I hadn't expected. You may be asked to testify, she said. Not against your son directly. About what you experienced. The word testify hung between us. I thanked her and ended the call, then sat alone, letting that possibility settle. Days later, Linda called one last time. She said her role was officially complete, but she wanted to warn me when investigations expand. She said, families sometimes try to rewrite history. She asked if anyone had contacted me, asking me to reconsider statements, to soften language, to remember things differently. I thought of Claire's letter. Not directly, I said. Linda paused. If that changes, she said, call me. It did change. Daniel called me late one evening. Weeks of silence behind him. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. He didn't accuse, he didn't argue. He asked if we could talk, really talk. Without lawyers, without records. I told him no. He sighed and said he understood. Then he said something that tightened my chest. "They're asking about you," he said. "About what you knew and when." I asked who they were. He didn't answer. After that call, sleep became harder again. Not because I feared Daniel, but because I feared the shape this was taking. Stories that start in kitchens sometimes end in courtrooms. Susan confirmed that an interview request might come. She coached me gently, not on what to say, but on how to stay grounded. "Truth doesn't need embellishment," she said. "Just clarity." I practiced answering simple questions, keeping emotion out of it. Still, the thought of speaking about my son in that setting made my stomach knot. The request came sooner than expected. A formal letter, polite and precise, asking if I would be willing to provide a statement regarding events leading up to the failed venture. I wasn't compelled yet. Willing was the word they used. I took the letter to Susan's office. She read it carefully, then looked up at me. "This is the moment you decide how much distance you want," she said. "Silence protects you. Speaking protects the truth." I asked which one protected my son. She didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," she said finally, "those are no longer the same thing." I went home and sat at my table, the same place I'd signed my name so many times in my life. I thought about the language Daniel used that night, the confidence with which he spoke about me as if I were already gone. I thought about how close I'd come to signing something that would have erased me quietly. And I thought about how this wasn't just about money or houses or documents anymore. It was about patterns, about who gets believed when power shifts. That evening, another message arrived from Claire. Shorter this time, more careful. She said people were turning on Daniel. She said she didn't know what was true anymore. She asked if I would consider speaking up for him, saying he'd been under stress, that none of it was malicious. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I closed my phone without replying. I didn't know yet what I would do. I only knew that whatever came next would define more than this conflict. It would define how the story ended in records, not memories. And as I folded the interview request letter and placed it back in its envelope, one question refused to leave me. When the truth finally demanded a voice, would staying silent still protect me, or would it become the last mistake I could afford to make? I agreed to speak, but only on my terms. Susan arranged the meeting in her office. Neutral ground, clean lines, no surprises. 2 investigators arrived, polite and careful. Notebooks closed until I invited questions. They didn't ask about my feelings. They asked about dates, words, documents, patterns. I answered simply, resisting the urge to explain motives or soften edges. Truth, I learned, doesn't need defense when it's allowed to stand intact. They asked about the dinner. I told them what was said and in which language. They asked how I knew. I explained my past without drama. They asked about the pressure afterward, the filings, the visits, the photo. I handed over copies I'd already provided. When they asked whether I believed my son intended to deceive me, I paused. "I believe he intended to use me," I said. "Whether he believed his reasons justified, that is something only he can answer." One of them nodded and wrote that down. After they left, Susan closed the door and sat across from me. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't reassure me. She said, "You did exactly what you needed to do." Outside, traffic moved as if nothing had changed. Inside, something had. I felt lighter, not because the story was over, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. The weeks that followed were quiet in a different way. Official letters arrived, then stopped. Daniel didn't call. Claire didn't write. The news cycle moved on, replacing one cautionary tale with another. Susan confirmed there would be no action against me, and no further requests unless circumstances changed. Mark stopped by less often, not out of concern now, but out of habit. "You okay?" he asked once. I nodded. It was true. One afternoon, A final letter came from Daniel's lawyer. Short, formal. It confirmed boundaries, acknowledged receipt of documents, and stated there would be no further contact unless required by law. I signed and returned it. That was the last paper tied to his name I would touch. When the mailbox closed, it felt ceremonial, a small ending to a long unraveling. Months passed. The house settled into itself. I repaired things I'd ignored while watching my back. I donated boxes of old papers, kept the few that mattered. I cooked meals slowly, without the feeling of being rushed by someone else's timeline. On evenings when the light was soft, I sat at the table and practiced saying no in my head, not angrily, not defensively, just clearly. It felt like learning a language I should have known all along. I thought about Daniel often, but not with the sharpness I expected, more with curiosity than pain. How a man convinces himself that silence equals consent. How easily love becomes leverage when money enters the room. How quickly patience is mistaken for permission. I didn't excuse him. I didn't excuse him. I didn't condemn him. I let the facts exist without decoration. That too was new. One day, Claire's sister wrote me a brief note. She said Claire had moved back temporarily, that things were strained, that there were consequences on all sides. She didn't ask me for anything. She just wanted me to know. I wrote back one sentence. I hope you're all safe. It was the only truth that felt necessary. The reset hook Susan warned me about came quietly. An acquaintance mentioned Daniel had taken a job far away, starting over somewhere anonymity felt possible. No details, no bitterness, just distance. I felt relief. I didn't need to celebrate. Distance sometimes is the most merciful ending, looking back. The power shift didn't happen in court or on paper. It happened the moment I answered him in that language and refused to perform ignorance for someone else's comfort. Everything after was consequence, catching up to confidence. People ask how I stayed calm. The answer is simple. I listened. I documented. I waited, not out of fear, but out of respect for truth's timing. If there's a lesson, it isn't about revenge. It's about clarity, about understanding that dignity doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up when you refuse to be rushed into erasing yourself. It shows up when you choose precision over emotion and boundaries over bargaining. It shows up when you stop confusing family with entitlement. I still keep the table set simply. One place, one glass, one chair where I can see the door. Not because I'm afraid, but because awareness is a habit worth keeping. When I think of that dinner now, I don't hear the laughter anymore. I hear the pause I chose. The space where a decision was made without spectacle. Understanding every word didn't give me power over my son. It gave me power over myself, and that, it turns out, was enough.